Imagine a world where beauty meant looking like you hadn't seen sunlight since the invention of windows. A world where being nearly translucent wasn't a health concern, it was a brag. And where poisoning yourself with metal dust was just another day in front of the mirror. Welcome to the dangerously delicate world of medieval beauty. Now, before we sink into this rabbit hole of powdered poisons, eyebrow conspiracies, and forehead real estate projects, do me a favor, follow or subscribe to the channel if you love weird, witty dives into history's strangest corners. And tell me in the comments, where on earth are you watching from? And is it too late to be hearing about medieval skin rot? Alright, dim those lights, let the gentle hum of a fan soothe your ears, and prepare yourself for a story where glamour and grave danger were basically the same thing. Back in the Middle Ages, looking like you'd just barely survived, a haunting wasn't just fashionable, it was essential. In a time when physical labor was the mark of peasants, being ghostly pale meant you didn't work outside. You didn't do things. You simply existed. In velvet sleeves, in shadows, away from the dirty rays of the sun. Nowadays, a sun-kissed tan means you've been on holiday, or at least pretending to drink green juice on a yoga mat. But centuries ago, tan skin screamed one thing: I have touched a shovel. And in high society that was social suicide. So, what did beauty look like back then? Not just pale, vampire-level pale. We're talking so white you could see the map of your veins like a blueprint. So washed out you might mistake someone for a recently startled ghost. Or maybe just the ghost's ghost. But, nature being the uncooperative rascal it is, didn't always serve up ghostly elegance on demand. So people improvised. The wealthy, both women and men, often turned to makeup made with white lead, the same stuff we now call hazardous waste. This powder delivered that divine deathbed glow, and came with the small side effect of, well, slow poisoning. But hey, what's a little toxic decay when you're trying to look fabulous? If lead wasn't your thing, you could bleach your face with vinegar-soaked cloths, or mash up pearls with egg whites and smear the result onto your cheeks. Because nothing says glamorous like the aroma of stale breakfast omelette wafting from your pores. To add a bit of visual drama, some painted delicate blue veins across their chest and arms, like your skin was too delicate to contain your own bloodstream. It was the medieval equivalent of flexing your fragility. Imagine telling people, "Oh, this? Just my veins. Aren't they adorable?" Even poetry got in on the trend. Women were described as white as snow, pale as moonlight in midwinter, and one was compared to, wait for it, the moon itself, because in medieval romance, nothing said desirable like someone who looked like they might faint during a light breeze. This wasn't just about looks, it was status. Being able to appear weak, fragile, and medically questionable was a clear sign. I don't farm, I don't cook, and I certainly don't sweat. Beauty was a badge of class, and pale skin was the crown jewel. And the routine didn't stop with face powder. No. To maintain that silky pale complexion, medieval nobles layered on mercury-based blush to add some colour and possibly hallucinations, followed by chalk dust for staying power. A thin brush of egg white smoothed it all into a nice, shiny glaze, the medieval version of setting spray. Bonus: if you stood still too long, someone might try to serve you on toast. What was in these products? Oh, just your friendly neighborhood blend of barnyard ingredients and chemical warfare. Lead caused everything from skin ulcers and rotting flesh to hair loss and nervous system failure. Mercury. That added a bit of madness to the mix. But hey, at least you looked like you belonged at court, right before you were carried out of it. The pressure to be dangerously beautiful wasn't limited to women either. Male courtiers weren't immune. Especially as the Renaissance crept in, image mattered sometimes more than ancestry, or even personal hygiene. A well-powdered face and faintly glowing complexion said you were refined, educated, and hopefully not contagious. But nothing, and I mean nothing, says medieval glam like the legendary forehead. Ah yes, the forehead, the silent battleground of beauty. In the 14th century, a high, smooth forehead was the ultimate sign of sophistication. The taller and more unbroken the dome, the more refined your soul. It suggested intellect, nobility, and spiritual superiority, or at the very least, that you hadn't laughed in 10 years. So what did noble women do? They erased the evidence of natural human design. Eyebrows were yanked out entirely. Hairlines were pulled back, strand by agonizing strand, to stretch the forehead skyward. It wasn't grooming, it was land development. And the methods? Oh, buckle in, tweezers, sure, but also hot cloths, vinegar, and creams made from cat dung or quicklime. If it stung, smelled, or made your skin feel like it was peeling off, it was working. Imagine walking into your medieval bathroom, a torch flickering on the wall, and whispering, "Bring me the leeches. I must look divine tonight." Paintings from the time show women with enormous, gleaming foreheads that seem to float above their features. Combine that with snow-white skin and the barest trace of emotion, and you've got a look that says, "I have never touched soil, and I might be a marble statue." To support this aesthetic, fashion joined the game. Headpieces like Hennins, those iconic cone hats and tight-fitting veils, helped conceal where the eyebrows used to be. Some even faked a high forehead by drawing one higher on their scalp and hiding the rest under cloth. It was contouring, 14th century style, with bonus itchiness. And don't think this was a niche trend. From England to France, Italy to the Holy Roman Empire, aristocratic women adopted the look, and poets praised it. They described women whose faces began somewhere near the top of their skulls, because nothing says dateable like looking constantly surprised. Not everyone had the time or courage to rip out their face foliage. So medieval innovators found shortcuts. They shaved, they painted, they disguised. Headbands and veils helped hide natural brows, but the message was clear eyebrows? Unnecessary, unwelcome, unfashionable. They were seen as weeds on the perfect, pale canvas of your face. Many went the extra mile, using mixtures with, I kid you not, arsenic, to make sure those brows stayed gone. Because when your beauty routine involves arsenic, you've committed to the aesthetic. And yes, there's art to back all this up. Illuminated manuscripts, portraits, even religious imagery, all show women with smooth foreheads, haunting eyes, and not a single brow hair in sight. They weren't just beautiful, they were ethereal, or creepy, depending on the lighting. Interestingly, not every region bought into the total brow erasure plan. In places where Byzantine or Middle Eastern styles bled in through trade or conquest, thinner, shaped brows stuck around. But for most of Europe, it was clear, if your face had texture, you were practically a goat herder. Strange? Yes. Dangerous? Absolutely. But compelling? Always. And that's what makes the world of medieval beauty so hypnotic. It wasn't just fashion. It was identity. It was sacrifice. And sometimes it was fatal. But one thing's for sure, they went all in. If you're enjoying this wild, weird journey through time, don't forget to follow or subscribe the channel. You're not going to want to miss what's coming next because trust me, this was just the opening act. Of crimes. If you've been doing your eyebrows like it's no big deal, congratulations. In the medieval world, you'd be doing it wrong. Spectacularly wrong. Because back then, having brows was practically scandalous, a hairy rebellion against the golden dome of beauty perfection. And this wasn't just a ladies-only ritual. No, sir. Men, especially the ones who spent their days lurking in royal courts or composing ballads about pious glances, occasionally trimmed or shaped their brows too. Though full removal was rare, unless of course you lost them in a heated theological debate or an unfortunate candle accident. What this tells us is simple. Medieval beauty had nothing to do with looking natural. It was about looking intentional, sculpted, otherworldly. You weren't trying to look like a person, you were aiming to resemble an angel, a statue, or possibly a well-mannered ghost. And angels, in medieval artwork, rarely had eyebrows. Coincidence? Maybe. But the style caught on. Now, let's talk colour, not too much, mind you. Just enough to look like you accidentally overheard a mildly scandalous poem or brushed past a stranger who smelled faintly of cloves. That's right, cheek colour was in, but proceed with caution. In the Middle Ages, even blushing had rules, consequences, and the occasional threat of eternal damnation. A soft, pink flush suggested you were young, healthy, and capable of bearing children, all top-tier compliments in a society where living past 30 was practically wizardry. But here's the tricky part. Looking like you cared too much was considered vain. And vanity? Suspiciously close to sin. So, if you were applying rouge, it had to be done with the subtlety of a saint. A dab, a whisper, a secret smudge, anything more, and you risked being mistaken for a French courtesan, or, worse, someone with confidence. The horror. The church, of course, watched all this with a holy side-eye. Unless you were nobility or somehow applying makeup in an act of divine humility, rouge was a no-go. And yet, women found their ways. Creativity bloomed under religious scrutiny. Common blush options, beet juice, smashed strawberries, mulberries, or for those feeling especially hardcore cochineal, a brilliant red pigment made from crushed bugs. Yes, bugs. Because beauty, then and now, is often equal parts glamour and what were we thinking. Some opted for wine sediment or a bit of red ochre. Others just pinched their cheeks and prayed for the best. And if the local priest asked about your glow, you'd blame the wind or say you were embarrassed by his sermon on modesty. For the wealthy, there were more dangerous options. Red lead and cinnabar, both as toxic as they sound. But hey, if the price of looking alive was a little mercury in the bloodstream, so be it. I may die young, they thought, but I'll die adored with pink cheeks and a flawless funeral portrait. Mirror access was limited, so makeup was applied by feel, habit, or the occasional brutally honest maid. If you had a mirror, it was probably tiny, warped, or being shared with 3 sisters and an anxious goose. Precision was a luxury. And yes, even nuns sometimes added a touch of rouge on feast days. Just a bit, mind you. Enough to say, I serve God, but also, I still have bone structure. The Lord works in mysterious ways. Hair, too, had its heavenly rules. If your locks didn't glow like divine threads spun by angels, you were already behind. Blonde hair was the look, symbol of youth, virtue, and otherworldly charm. Never mind that most people didn't naturally have it. Didn't matter. Even the Virgin Mary, painted over and over with golden tresses, was given an artistic blonde upgrade, despite geography insisting otherwise. If you were born fair-haired, congratulations, you were practically royalty by default. But the problem? Blonde hair rarely sticks around after childhood. So, naturally, medieval women got inventive. Homemade lightening treatments included a delightful stew of chamomile, ash, honey, saffron, and lye. Yes, actual lye. These were applied, then left to bake in the sun during a process called sunbasking, which sounds relaxing until you remember you're marinating your scalp in ammonia and praying your head doesn't catch fire. Some recipes even called for urine. Whose urine? Don't ask. Just know that if your hair sparkled, it was worth it. Beauty has always flirted with the grotesque, and medieval hair care was flirting with it hard. Hair texture mattered too. Loose, flowing waves were the dream. Think soft, effortless, divine waterfall. But here's the catch. Only unmarried women could wear their hair down in public. Once married, that glorious cascade was locked away tighter than the church treasury. The moment you said, I do, your hair became a private treasure, not to be flaunted. Enter veils, wimples, nets, and layers upon layers of modesty cloth, because nothing says taken like a head wrapped in 3 feet of beige linen. Noble women braided, twisted, and tucked their hair into elaborate coils, often embellished with ribbons, beads, or tiny bits of embroidery, visual reminders that they were far too refined to touch livestock. Meanwhile, men weren't left out of the fantasy. Male poets often romanticized golden-haired knights charging into battle with their locks flying heroically in the wind, the medieval version of a shampoo ad. Hair in many ways was currency. To flaunt it was a message. For unmarried women, long, unbound hair signaled purity, but not too unbound. Letting it spill freely down your back was only acceptable if you were a literal saint or seconds away from martyrdom. Otherwise, a polite braid would suffice. Once wed, hair was no longer for public consumption. The modest married woman's wardrobe included coiffes, veils, and wimples, sometimes all at once. A woman's head might be swaddled like a sacred relic. Fashion? Sure, but also armor. Protection from smoke, lice, and the occasional overeager lute player. The truly devout layered their coverings. A close-fitting coif under a translucent veil under a tightly pinned wimple. The result? A pious, well-bundled sandwich of social virtue. Modesty with a side of fabric engineering. But modesty doesn't mean boring. As the centuries rolled on, headwear got bold. Nets were woven with gold thread. Veils were starched into stiff geometries. And some noble women wore intricate hair cages. Yes, literal cages, complete with tiny jewels and even bells. Subtle? No. Effective? Absolutely. Everyone in the room knew when you turned your head. Hair wasn't just hair. It was morality, class, and allure, all wrapped up in silken restraint. And if you dared leave a curl peeking out? Scandal. Or maybe fashion rebellion. Depends on how good your veil was. Of course, some women played the game smart. They let a bit of dyed hair slip through a transparent veil, technically covered, but still visible. A medieval loophole. Because even in an era obsessed with rules, people still found ways to bend them beautifully. And now to the skies. Because if medieval beauty had an unspoken rule, it was this. The taller your accessories, the taller your status. And no item captured this better than the legendary hennin. You've seen them. Those soaring cone-shaped hats that look like a church bell fell in love with a curtain rod. Hennins weren't just headwear, they were architectural statements. You didn't wear a hennin. You carried it like a portable tower of power. These lofty hats, especially popular in 15th century France and Burgundy, could reach up to 2 feet tall. That's right, 2 feet. Of pointy silk grandeur, swaying delicately above your skull as you tried not to knock over a candelabra. The higher the hennin, the higher your rank. And yes, there were casualties. Door frames were not your friend. Neither were low ceilings or windy gardens. But it was worth it. Made of brocade, velvet, or fine silk, and held together by internal wire structures, the hennin turned your head into a fashion landmark. A long veil often cascaded from the tip, floating behind you like a bridal ghost. And your hair? Well, it had to be wrangled. Braided tightly or shaved back at the forehead, always with that same obsession for real estate up top. Forehead room was key. If your hennin sat too far forward, it was practically a fashion felony. But the hennin was just one player in a rising vertical trend. Women also wore heart-shaped escapons, think side buns shaped like croissants and butterfly hennins, with veils spread like wings, perfect for catching the breeze or fanning nearby suitors unconscious. Because in the world of medieval beauty, nothing was ever low-key. Of crimes. Let's be honest, towering headgear that looked like it could summon lightning wasn't everyone's cup of mead. For those not living in castles or composing sonnets about piety, fashion was a little more grounded. Most women stuck with simple linen caps, veils, or delicate circlets, the kind of headwear that didn't risk scraping the ceiling beams or accidentally knocking out a candle holder. They were less dramatic, yes, but also far less likely to make you look like a well-dressed siege weapon. As you might imagine, the more conservative voices of the time, clergy, monks, serious men with very long robes and very short senses of humor, weren't fans of the hennin craze. They warned that such extravagance invited vanity, flirtation, possibly heresy, and almost certainly neck pain. And yet, despite every sermon muttered in dimly lit chapels, hennins remained wildly popular. Because as history has taught us many times, impractical fashion almost always wins, especially if it's expensive and hard to walk in. And don't worry, men weren't left out of the fashion chaos. No, they had their own medieval statements to make. Feathered caps so plumed they could pass for an endangered species, fur-trimmed hoods that made summer completely unbearable, and shoes so absurdly pointed they could double as dueling weapons or, if needed, fishing spears. Fashion was dramatic, sometimes dangerous, but never dull. Now, let's take a step back or maybe a fainting swoon into the world of the medieval body ideal. And let me tell you, this wasn't about having curves or abs or looking like you just conquered a gym. Nope. The goal was to appear delicate, dreamy, and faintly malnourished, like someone who had just woken from a poetic coma, or perhaps survived on dew and harp music. The ideal woman was slim and soft, with a gentle, almost ghostly presence, like she'd spent the last 6 months sipping honey water and sighing out windows. Physical strength? Not exactly on the wish list. Beauty manuals didn't encourage women to build stamina or muscles. The only acceptable form of lifting was maybe your silk veil, and even that was best done with a trembling hand and a wistful glance downward. But make no mistake, this wasn't about looking sickly. At least, not too sickly. The sweet spot was somewhere between too fragile to lift a pail and gracefully playing a lute while pretending not to be dizzy. The ideal figure gave off the impression that you were noble, dainty, and definitely not built for manual labor. If you had the arms of a dairymaid, you'd best cover them and quietly apologize. So how was this look achieved? With fashion trickery, of course. Dresses were tailored to elongate the torso and narrow the waist. Waistlines were often pulled just below the bust, an early version of what we now call the empire waist. It created the illusion of height and helped make the wearer appear angelic and slightly underfed. And if your body didn't naturally align with this vision, tight lacing was there to help. Not corsets, those came later, but tightly drawn kirtles and sideless surcoats could shape your figure just enough to suggest fragile elegance and mild discomfort. Too thin, though, that was a red flag. Being overly slender during a time of famine or plague was associated with sickness, or worse, being near death. A touch of roundness in the cheeks or hips was actually seen as attractive. It suggested fertility, health, and the rare ability to survive winter without turning into a cautionary tale. The medieval approach to health and beauty advice? Let's call it creatively imbalanced. Some guides recommended fennel to ease digestion, rose petals for better breath, and red wine for a brighter complexion. And meat? Only if it still had feathers. Because who needs iron when you can glow from the inside out with medieval mysticism? Men, meanwhile, had more leeway. They were allowed to have muscle as long as they didn't look like they worked for it. Nobility still preferred a slender, refined figure. Broad shoulders and strong legs were fine. Just don't show up looking like you just won a wrestling match with a pig. Posture was more important than power, but when it came to silent beauty, nothing spoke louder than the eyes. A woman's gaze in the Middle Ages was her ultimate weapon, soft, soulful, and preferably capable of converting a wandering knight with a single flutter. The ideal medieval eyes were wide, innocent, and just a little mournful, the kind of eyes that looked like they'd personally witnessed the fall of Eden and were still recovering, politely. Poets absolutely adored them. They wrote of eyes like dewdrops, holy orbs, or shimmering pools of unspoken virtue. You know what they didn't write about? Redness, puffiness, or the haunted stare of someone who stayed up all night churning butter. In Northern Europe, light-coloured eyes, pale blue or grey, were considered the height of beauty, suggesting purity and a healthy lack of experience. In Southern Europe, darker eyes held their own power, often tied to noble lineage and, more importantly, a good dowry. Enhancing one's eyes, though, that was tricky. No mascara, no eyeliner pens, just charcoal, soot, or crushed herbs if you dared. A dab of black around the lashes could make the eyes look bigger, yes, but it also risked blurry vision, burning, or, let's be honest, starting history's first unintentional goth trend. Most women didn't bother. Instead, they relied on nature and candlelight. Want to appear more wide-eyed? Stand beside a flame. Want to look virtuous? Look downward at all times, even if it means tripping over a chicken. The technique worked. The message was, I'm full of humility, and possibly about to faint. Slightly watery eyes were a bonus. They signaled piety, tenderness, and emotional depth. If you couldn't cry on cue, staring into wood smoke or enduring some mild public shame usually did the trick, because nothing says, I'm blessed and mysterious, like a moist glisten and a faraway look. And eye contact? A dangerous game. Too much and you risked being labelled bold, flirtatious, or worst of all, French. Too little, and you might come off as shady or demon-possessed. The trick was to look up only occasionally, from beneath your lashes, like someone who had memorized the Psalms but didn't want to brag about it. Now let's touch on a rarely mentioned feature in medieval love poetry, breath. While knights rhapsodized about rosebud lips and ivory teeth, they usually skipped over what came out of those mouths, because, truthfully, medieval dental hygiene was about as polished as a peasant's wooden spoon. Toothpaste as we know it didn't exist. Mouthwash? Not a thing. And peppermint was something you grew, not chewed. Still, a sweet-smelling mouth was technically desirable. It implied youth, cleanliness, and that you hadn't eaten garlic-stuffed eel for breakfast, though statistically, you had. So what did people do? They got creative. Parsley, fennel seeds, cloves, cinnamon sticks, even the occasional chewable twig. Not for flavor, really just to keep the mouth fresh enough to avoid making someone pass out mid-conversation. Apothecaries sometimes sold herbal pastes or mouth rinses made from sage, myrrh, or vinegar. These were expensive, so people used them sparingly or simply avoided speaking too closely in public. Subtlety was key, grace over garlic. Toothbrushing, as we imagine it, wasn't a thing. Instead, people wiped their teeth with cloths, rubbed them with chalk or crushed herbs, or used chew sticks, fibrous twigs that doubled as breath fresheners and nervous props during awkward courtships. And bad breath? It wasn't exactly taboo. Everyone had it to some degree. They were too busy worrying about things like survival, sin, or being wrongly accused of witchcraft to sweat the scent of their words. But noble women, always aware of perception, tried their best. They kept conversations at arm's length. Public affection was rare. And when they did speak, it was with the quiet restraint of someone very aware that one misstep or exhale might end a marriage proposal before it began. Of crimes. And if you ever doubted yourself, if you ever felt the urge to smile too widely in medieval Europe, the safest bet was to pause, fan yourself gently, and look deeply contemplative. Bonus points if you carried a pomander, a small metal orb filled with scented herbs like cloves, rosemary, or something mysteriously labelled powder of roses, which you'd waft in your own direction every time a nearby breath became a little too medieval. Fast forward to today, and we swipe right for smiles bright, big, beaming. But in the Middle Ages, smiling was a calculated risk. You didn't just flash your teeth around like an overexcited troubadour. You smiled like you used spices, cautiously, with restraint, and only when absolutely necessary. Because here's the truth, teeth were terrifying. And not because people didn't care, but because they simply didn't have the tools. Oral hygiene at the time was more folklore than science. Most folks had a dental situation that ranged from slightly concerning to actively offensive, especially once you hit 30. So unless your teeth were blessed by divine intervention, the fewer people saw them, the better. The culprit? Diets loaded with bread, porridge and mead. No fluoride, no floss, no dentists unless you count a man named Gregor who owned rusty pliers and believed in yelling at cavities. Even though sugar was rare and expensive, the starches in everyday meals broke down into enamel-destroying disasters. Tooth decay was rampant. Extractions, when done, resembled exorcisms more than surgeries dramatic, painful, and likely to involve screaming in Latin. Still, a clean, white smile, if you had one, was admired in quiet awe. Just not advertised. You didn't grin. You didn't beam. The fashionable expression was a closed lip, knowing smile. A soft upward curve that said, "I've read 3 Psalms today, and only judged 2 people." Some women went to great lengths to maintain this mysterious allure. They used powders made from ground sage, crushed coral, or even salt to scrub their teeth clean or whiter, at least. These efforts were brave, mildly effective, and extremely abrasive. Think sandpaper for your molars. But overall, teeth were something to be endured, not flaunted. You won't find a single open-mouthed grin in most medieval paintings. Even saints kept their lips shut tight, as if they, too, were trying to avoid revealing the results of chewing on too many communion wafers. Men weren't exempt. A chiseled jawline might win hearts. A straight nose could inspire poetry. But gleaming teeth? Never mentioned. You won't find a ballad praising Sir Geoffrey's incisors. There's a reason medieval love songs stuck to eyes, hands, and flowing hair. Breath and bite alignment just didn't make the cut. And while we're on the subject of the ideal medieval man, let's talk about expectations. You didn't have to look like Hercules, but you definitely couldn't look like you'd been dragged behind a horse. The goal was to hit that sweet spot between could win a joust and would rather just write about it. The dream? Tall, lean, broad-shouldered, and dripping with noble indifference. Not too muscular that reeked of labour, not too soft that hinted at sloth and too much gravy. The perfect nobleman could swing a sword if he had to, but ideally he had a squire to do it for him. Facial structure mattered. A defined jawline, high cheekbones, and a straight nose were all prized. You were meant to resemble an illuminated manuscript's version of a prince, elegant, refined, and permanently lit by candlelight. Beards varied, clean-shaven, was fashionable in some regions, while others favoured well-groomed facial hair. Either way, the look had to be intentional. You weren't allowed to appear as though you'd just wandered out of the forest. Hair was a whole production. Noblemen typically wore their hair shoulder length, styled into soft waves or natural curls. If those curls didn't come naturally, no problem. Enter curling irons. Yes, medieval men actually used small heated rods and herbal rinses to achieve that perfect noble flow. Because nothing says, "I've never worked a day in my life," like spending an hour getting your fringe to fall just right. Clothing helped shape the silhouette. Padded shoulders, fitted tunics, cinched waists. These tailored pieces carved the male form into a kind of armour of attractiveness. And posture was everything. A nobleman didn't slouch, he glided, ideally with his hands behind his back and the faintest whiff of disapproval for anything muddy or manual. If a man did happen to be muscular, that was fine as long as he wasn't seen using those muscles to, say, lift barrels. Fighting in wars? Socially acceptable. Chopping firewood? Barbaric. Above all, the look had to seem effortless. You weren't trying to look good. You simply were good. Born with land, titles, and the kind of cheekbones that made serfs look twice. It was a medieval version of hot without trying, except instead of a gym routine you had a bloodline, a falcon, and an estate. Now, let's take a long sniff into the least glamorous but arguably most critical part of medieval beauty: scent. Bathing was, well, complicated. Not because people didn't want to be clean, but because soap, plumbing, and regular hot water weren't exactly household staples. Depending on the century, the region, and whether the Black Death was making a comeback, baths ranged from occasional luxury to outright suspicion. So scent became a survival strategy. People relied on herbs, oils, and what can only be described as olfactory optimism. The pomander, that charming scented orb we mentioned earlier, wasn't just for show. Worn on a chain, tucked into a sleeve, or pinned to a belt, it was filled with aromatic mixtures of cinnamon, sage, rosemary, and sometimes more mysterious ingredients like powdered rose petals. Think of it as the medieval Febreze grenade designed to mask both you and the person speaking too closely. The wealthy also indulged in scented gloves, perfumed combs, and herbal sachets sewn into their clothing. Everything that could carry a scent did. Even hair was rinsed in floral water or lightly vinegar-infused blends that, depending on the batch, smelled somewhere between meadow breeze and medicated despair. Sweat was a fact of life. Clothes were heavy. Summers were brutal. Deodorant? Still a distant invention waiting to change history's armpits. So people layered linen undergarments beneath their elaborate wool or silk outfits. Linen was washable, or at least more washable than brocade, and helped absorb the worst of the human condition. Some brave souls even placed dried herbs between their layers, in hopes that the scent of time would cancel out the scent of time itself. Bathing did exist, especially during certain periods when public bathhouses were in fashion. But even then, access varied wildly. The church grew increasingly wary of communal bathing, something about temptation, nudity, and the devil-loving steam, so hygiene enthusiasm took a dip. Instead, many practiced what was cheerfully known as dry bathing. That meant wiping yourself with a cloth and then applying scented water, a sort of spiritual shower with no actual water involved. Imagine cleaning a table with a napkin and then spraying it with rose water. Same energy. Some folks took it to extremes, keeping petals in their shoes, herbs under their pillows, or lavender sprigs hidden in their undergarments. Anything to give the illusion that they lived near a garden rather than a goat pen. Because in medieval Europe, beauty wasn't just about how you looked. It was about how you smelled, how you stood, and how you navigated the razor-thin line between divine perfection and scandalous vanity. A flawless face wasn't just admired, it was political. A blessing, a burden, sometimes even a trap. Because beauty was never just surface deep, not then, and certainly not now. And trust me, we haven't even scratched the surface of what people really did in the name of looking holy, heavenly, and high-born. So if this walk through medieval elegance has left you wide-eyed and slightly itchy, follow or subscribe the channel because we're only just getting started. Of crimes. In medieval Europe, beauty wasn't just skin deep, it was a trap, a blessing, a curse, and a social riddle wrapped in powdered lead. On one hand, looking beautiful clear skin, soft features, and a pale porcelain-like complexion was seen as divine. If you were pleasing to look at, surely you were touched by grace, chosen by God, a walking proof of inner virtue, or at the very least, someone unlikely to steal livestock. Beauty was elevated to something almost sacred, praised by poets, admired by painters, and endlessly sermonized by preachers who really should have been focusing on more pressing sins. But here's the twist. If you knew you were beautiful, if you dared to enjoy it, or heaven forbid, used that beauty to your advantage, the whispers began. Vanity, they said. Pride, temptation. And just like that, your angelic glow was recast as something dangerously close to the devil's work, particularly if your lashes fluttered in the wrong direction or your hair peeked out from under the veil. And if your charm caught the attention of a nobleman, oh no, that was your fault, entirely. Blame Eve. That poor woman took the fall for one snack, and medieval Europe turned it into a millennium-long public relations campaign. Every time a man sinned, it was traced back to a woman's face. Her smile, her hair, her mere existence. Beauty wasn't just power, it was responsibility, suspicion, and in many cases, a very fast way to get accused of witchcraft. If a woman wore makeup, if she walked with too much confidence, or saints forbid looked better than the local baron's wife, she could be labelled immoral, manipulative, or even demonic. Some believed beauty itself was an illusion, a trick played by witches and enchantresses to lead good men astray. Glamour spells, they called them. Not the sparkly kind, the burn her at the stake kind. It sounds extreme now, but remember this was an age when a bad crop or stormy weather could get you accused of consorting with the devil. Beauty? That was a volatile currency. And just as beauty could mark you as chosen, the absence of it could doom you to suspicion. Women who were considered plain or unfortunate-looking were often thought to be cursed, sinful, or the product of divine disappointment. The belief that your appearance mirrored your soul was more than superstition. In many corners of the church, it was doctrine. Beauty meant you were favored. Ugliness meant you had probably done something to deserve it. So, there you were walking a medieval tightrope. Be beautiful, but not too beautiful. Appear radiant, but don't dare to know it. Glow with inner virtue, but don't glow brighter than your neighbor, especially if your neighbor's husband was watching. And never, ever look more attractive than a nobleman's wife. That was a one-way journey to a nunnery, or a suspicious fever that no one talked about again. In the end, beauty standards in the Middle Ages were not about aesthetics. They were about morality, control, and survival. It was a balancing act between appearing angelic and avoiding the label of siren. A public performance, with a costume of powder and prayer. A constant battle between modesty and magnetism. And just when you think the story couldn't take a sharper turn, let's talk about the Immortals. Because halfway across the known world, in the vast empire of Persia, beauty looked nothing like fragility, it looked like power. The Immortals of the Achaemenid Empire weren't just soldiers. They were a living symbol, a human declaration that the empire itself was eternal, unbroken, and absolutely terrifying. They didn't emerge from whispers or court gossip. They came with marching feet, steel in their hands, and silk on their backs. Born under Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE, the Immortals were conceived not just as warriors, but as a message. Cyrus understood something vital to build an empire that lasted. You didn't just need governors and generals. You needed theatrical muscle, a force so flawless, so unwavering, that it made rebellions pause and kings think twice. And so, the Immortals were born 0 of them, always. That was the genius. If one died, replaced. If one fell ill, another filled his place instantly. Their numbers never dipped, never changed. From the outside, it looked like they could not bleed, could not falter, and certainly could not die. Whether it was myth-making or meticulous accounting, the result was the same psychological dominance. You didn't just face an army, you faced immortality. But these weren't common foot soldiers drafted from farmland and panic. To become an immortal, you needed pedigree. You came from noble families, proven loyal to the empire, raised with discipline and pride. Training began young. Brutal, unrelenting, and soaked in the values of obedience and composure. They weren't just taught to fight, they were taught to represent. They weren't only feared for their skill, they were feared for what they meant. These men were the muscle of Persia's image, sent across deserts and mountains, from Lydia to Egypt, wherever the empire's light reached. When the Immortals showed up, it wasn't just a battle line approaching, it was the will of the empire, armed and walking toward you. They dressed with precision, robes of fine fabric, armor hidden beneath, made from iron or bronze scales that moved like water but protected like stone. Their shields were wicker, their spears deadly. And always, always, they were immaculately arranged. Where Greek hoplites stormed the battlefield glinting like golden statues, the Immortals arrived like a shadow sweeping across the land. A wave of nobility and war wrapped in colour and silence. Their tunics and trousers were dyed in the deep reds and purples of royalty colours that didn't whisper, but declared. It was psychological warfare, wrapped in silk. When Persian kings entered battle, the Immortals marched beside them. When kings gave speeches, the Immortals stood behind. They weren't just soldiers, they were the throne's shadow. The physical embodiment of continuity. You could kill a soldier. You couldn't kill this army. Because it would always be 10, 0 strong. Always watching, always marching. They didn't blink. They didn't retreat. And they didn't die. And that, perhaps, was their most dangerous weapon. The illusion that they were endless. So from the soft powder of noble cheeks in European castles, to the ironclad calm of warriors crossing Persian sands, beauty, whether delicate or disciplined, was never just about appearance. It was always about power, about identity, about control, and in both cases, behind every painted face and polished spear, lay the same human truth. If the world sees you as beautiful or immortal, you'd better make sure you know the cost. Of crimes. Their shields didn't glint like polished bronze. They didn't roar like lions before battle. They didn't need to. Made from tightly woven wicker, the Immortals' shields were deceptively light, but don't mistake lightness for weakness. These shields could absorb arrows, deflect blades, and flex without breaking. They were tools of endurance, not display. But their most haunting symbol? Their headdress. Not a towering helmet or gilded crown, but a simple felt cap, the tiara. Soft, unassuming, and sometimes pulled down over the face to obscure the man behind it. The result? A warrior with no visible fear and no visible identity. Where the Greeks exalted individual glory, every hoplite a hero, every scar a badge, the Immortals flourished in the anonymity of unity. 10,000 men, all dressed alike, all armed alike, all moving in near total silence. When they advanced, they weren't just soldiers, they were a tide. A curtain of inevitability descending over the battlefield. It wasn't war, it was theatre. And the Immortals were the actors who never broke character. Each man carried a short spear, a bow and quiver slung across his back, and a curved short sword at his side, deadly in close quarters. But it wasn't their weapons that made them legendary, it was how they moved. Speed, coordination, endurance. These men could cross entire provinces on foot and arrive in perfect formation. Their training favoured agility over brute strength. Unlike many ancient armies that relied on raw power and loud declarations, the Immortals relied on rhythm, precision, and the kind of focus that made lesser forces falter before the first blade was drawn. They were just as comfortable standing behind a royal throne as they were charging across open terrain. Whether in the emperor's palace or the chaos of war, they held their ground. No hesitation, no showmanship, just silent, well-practiced devastation. Their armor was light, their weapons efficient, their movements fluid. They weren't made to crush, they were made to last. That was the secret. Not overpowering strength, but unfailing presence. And when you can't shake them, can't outpace them, can't break them, that's when fear sets in. Because consistency, in war, is power. And that eerie consistency? It wasn't accidental. It was the core of the immortal legend. When they marched into battle, you didn't hear screaming or war cries. You heard drums, deep, thunderous, hypnotic. You saw dust rise behind their steps, like a warning whispered by the earth itself. But the Immortals? They remained stone-faced. No roars, no chants. Just synchronized movement like they weren't men at all, but machines carved from law and loyalty. To face them wasn't to face soldiers. It was to face the idea that some armies didn't fight. They endured. Without pause, without pity, without even acknowledging that you were standing in their way. And to be one of them, that wasn't a profession. It was an identity, a transformation, maybe even a sentence. Yes, the Immortals were revered, richly clothed, respected, rewarded. But beneath the robes of purple and the scales of bronze was a life of strict, unrelenting control. Their food, clothing, and shelter were all provided, not out of kindness, but out of necessity. The Empire had to own every piece of them. There could be no deviation, no softness, no delay. From the moment a boy entered training, his life belonged to Persia. Most came from noble families, Persian, Median, or Elamite. Others, the younger sons of loyal families, could rise into the ranks through sheer discipline, but no one entered by accident. Training began in childhood. Archery from horseback, marching in silence, standing still for hours, learning how to endure hunger, heat, cold, and most of all, learning to obey. Not just follow orders, embody them. There was no room for ambition, no desire to stand out. If you did, you were corrected. Unity was sacred. The formation could not ripple. Every day was a ritual. Rise before dawn. Drill in silence. Clean weapons. Maintain armor. Eat only what was required. Flatbread, meat, wine, dates. Enough to fuel the body. Never enough to soften it. Luxury was an enemy. And aristocrats who got too comfortable didn't last long. Even in peacetime, the Immortals didn't rest. At court, they weren't just ceremonial guards. They were shadow sentinels watching for treachery, shielding the king, enforcing order with silent precision. Their presence alone was often enough to halt an argument, to silence a political rival, to calm a panicked room. They didn't need to speak. Their silence was the command. They became the eyes and ears of the throne, trained not just to fight but to sense lies, read body language, spot fear. These weren't mere warriors. They were instruments of state control. And yet, they weren't completely removed from life. Immortals could marry. They could maintain households. But that home life came with a caveat. If duty called, you left. Immediately. No argument, no delay. One missed step, and the replacement was already marching into your place. Because the number that's sacred, unbroken 10, 0 could not dip. Ever. And that's what made them terrifying. Not just their discipline, not just their silence, but their ability to vanish one man and insert another without ripple, without pause, without even acknowledging it happened. They were a system, not a collection of individuals. They didn't just fight with control, they lived in control. If Cyrus the Great created the Immortals, then Darius the Great is the one who turned them into a myth. When Darius seized power in 522 BCE during a whirlwind of palace conspiracies, assassinations, and internal chaos, he turned to the Immortals as the steel that could hold his new empire together. They weren't just his protectors, they became his authority made visible. He didn't just rely on their swords, he put them on display. Parades, ceremonies, festivals. The Immortals became fixtures of the empire's pageantry. Darius stationed them at his new capital in Persepolis, wrapped them in ceremonial robes, and used them as political envoys. Wherever they appeared, so too did the power of Persia. Their presence said one thing: this empire does not shake. They weren't just tools of war anymore. They were a message, a visual declaration of permanence. And no matter what chaos surrounded the throne, the Immortals remained 10,000 shadows in step, a walking promise that order would always return. Because to see them, to hear the steady rhythm of their march, was to remember who held the world's leash. Of crimes, they were always there, silent, identical, 10,000 unwavering faces of Imperial, will never blinking, never shifting, never out of step. The Persian Immortals weren't just a symbol of the king's power, they were the king's power, sculpted into flesh and moved by command. But under Darius the Great, their role evolved. No longer merely a personal bodyguard or royal parade unit, the Immortals became the sharpened point of the empire's entire war machine. Darius, ever the master strategist, understood that victory didn't come from brute strength alone, it came from orchestration. He didn't just deploy them, he redefined them. The Immortals were woven into the very fabric of Persia's combined arms warfare. Now, they worked alongside cavalry, archers, and the thundering wheels of chariots in intricate, choreographed destruction. They didn't just respond, they struck in perfect time. Fluid, ruthless, synchronized. Darius pushed their training further than ever before. Archery drills intensified. Siege tactics were introduced. Battlefield coordination became an obsession. Greek observers would later write with a mixture of awe and dread about watching them advance their arrows falling like rain as they stepped forward behind wicker shields, their lines never breaking, their formation never faltering. And when the empire shook, as it often did, with revolts from the sands of Egypt to the edges of the Indus, the Immortals were the first sent in. They weren't just an elite fighting force. They were the whisper of retribution, the king's divine reminder. In Elam, in Babylon, in Syria. They arrived like judgment in human form, not only to suppress rebellion, but to announce it would never succeed. And with that, their legend darkened. They weren't just protectors anymore. They became instruments of fear, the empire's breath and blade. This transformation wasn't subtle, it was carved in stone. At Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Darius's regime, they are immortalized in endless reliefs, standing tall, perfectly symmetrical, eyes forward, weapons ready. A frozen army, etched into eternity. These weren't decorative flourishes, they were warnings, meant to speak without words. These men are always here, always watching, always armed, and they do not die. Through Darius, the Immortals stopped being just warriors. They became an institution of control, of fear, of total imperial discipline dressed in gold-threaded silk. They didn't merely serve the empire, they became the face of its invincibility. And then came Thermopylae. If their power was forged under Darius, it was tested under Xerxes. It was 480 BCE. The Persian Empire, vast and rolling, turned its gaze west toward Greece, and in one of the most mythologized clashes in ancient history, the Immortals walked into fire. Xerxes invaded with a force said to be the largest the world had ever seen, and at the core of that monstrous army, his trusted, unshakable Immortals, the royal vanguard, tasked with cutting through chaos and resistance like silk through wind. And at first, it looked like a formality. But then, a mountain pass. Thermopylae, a narrow throat of land where geography erased numbers and advantage. And standing in that pass, a few thousand Greeks led by King Leonidas of Sparta. Most famously, 300 Spartan warriors trained from childhood for one thing: to hold the line. The Persians sent wave after wave, but the Greeks held. The narrow terrain nullified the size of Xerxes' army. On the second day, with frustration mounting, Xerxes gave the order that should have ended it all. Send in the Immortals. The moment was meant to be devastating. 10,000 elite warriors, flawless in motion, flawless in training. They were the king's scalpel, his swift judgment. But what followed was not the swift collapse of Greek resistance. It was a grinding stalemate. The pass was too tight. The Immortals' short spears were ineffective against the long dory pikes of the hoplites. Their famed archery, useless in close quarters. The Greeks fought in phalanxes, wall upon wall of bronze and discipline. And as the Immortals advanced, they bled. They died. And for the first time in living memory, they failed. Even Herodotus, never shy about exaggeration, recorded the embarrassment. The Immortals, he said, had performed no better than common troops. And in that moment, their image cracked the illusion that they were invincible, untouchable, divine, shattered by sweat, dirt, and Spartan steel. But here's the thing. They didn't retreat. They didn't scatter. They adapted. Because immortality, real immortality, wasn't about never being wounded. It was about standing up after you are. And that is what the Immortals did. They reformed. They advanced again. Because while their myth may have cracked, their formation didn't. And what made them truly eternal wasn't their armor, or arrows, or even their legend. It was their system. The secret wasn't magic. It was bureaucracy. The Persians were masters of administration. and the Immortals were its most terrifying product. If one fell in battle, or even if he died quietly in his sleep, another took his place instantly. No mourning, no ceremony, no pause. The number always remained exactly 10,000. This wasn't a poetic flourish, it was enforced, designed. Behind every warrior on the front line was another in training, an invisible thread of readiness stretching from the battlefield to the heart of the Empire. A human chain of loyalty, discipline, and meticulous record-keeping. Young men were constantly groomed, trained, and rotated through lesser military roles, ready to fill gaps the moment they appeared. They were catalogued, supervised, inspected. Their lives weren't their own, they belonged to the machine. 10 commanders, the Hazarapatis, oversaw it all, each responsible for 1,000 men. Beneath them, a web of scribes, quartermasters, trainers, and informants tracked everything. Who was injured? Who was ready? Who was loyal? Lose a man in Egypt? His replacement was already being sent from the capital. One soldier breaks an ankle in the highlands of Media. His successor is sharpening his blade before breakfast. It wasn't just efficiency, it was psychology. To anyone who opposed Persia, the Immortals didn't reduce. They didn't thin out, they didn't vanish. They were always 10,000, always there. It didn't matter who they were, their names didn't matter. Their individuality was erased by design. They weren't heroes, they were presence. A hydra of order and silence. Cut off one head, another slipped into place. This wasn't war, it was pressure. Even off the battlefield, the system never blinked. If a family member of an Immortal was accused of betrayal, the soldier was quietly replaced. No scandal, no trial. Just one name scratched off the scroll and another stitched into the formation. And that, perhaps more than any spear or sword, was their real weapon. Not courage, not strength, but certainty. Cold, beautiful, unshakable. The Greeks fought for glory. The Immortals moved without ego, without pause, without identity. Because the machine didn't need heroes, it only needed to continue. Of crimes. To most, they were remembered as warriors, but those who truly understood power saw something more. Diplomats in armor, envoys of dominance. In the Achaemenid mind, military force wasn't just for conquest, it was for presence. And the Immortals were presence, embodied. They were sent not only to fight, but to be seen. To walk into foreign palaces not with threats or noise, but with spectacle. With poise. Imagine the scene. A Greek city humming with suspicion, or a Babylonian court teetering on edge. Through the gates, 10 figures step into view, not in stained leather or dented bronze, but in fine tunics embroidered with gold, robes flowing like royal banners. They move as one. They say nothing. Their eyes unreadable beneath soft felt tiaras. They don't posture. They don't draw weapons. They don't need to, because their presence alone is the negotiation. The Empire never needed to yell when the Immortals arrived. A whisper was louder when spoken through silk and steel. In the satrapies, the far-flung provinces of Persia, the Immortals served as constant, quiet reminders of the king's reach. They didn't govern. They didn't command. But they were always there, standing beside governors, watching, listening, waiting. And when rebellion stirred, if someone whispered too boldly in the wrong corner of the court, a squad of Immortals could appear without warning, like the sudden shadow of a coming storm. No words, no trial. Just a reminder that the Empire's patience was shorter than its memory was long. Even inside the royal court, their presence wasn't just ceremonial. During Nowruz festivals, coronations, royal banquets, yes, they stood tall, elegant, ornamental. But behind that ceremonial stillness was the awareness of every lie, every betrayal, every faltering oath. They weren't just soldiers. They were intelligence. Some historians now argue the Immortals operated as an early form of internal state security, a network of silent observation in soft boots and perfect posture. They didn't need to interrogate. They only needed to exist in the corner of the room for loyalty to snap back into place. That was the genius of their dual identity, warrior and emissary, blade and brocade, enforcer and ornament. They weren't fighting for personal glory like so many ancient elites. They served something far colder, far grander, a strategy of empire that understood war was just one language of power. the Immortals mastered every dialect, because in the Achaemenid world, the empire wasn't held together only by spears. It was held together by symbols. And nothing symbolized Persian order quite like 10 men in perfect step, speaking without speaking, warning without threatening. Their silence was louder than a war cry. When they entered a palace, the message arrived with them. The king sees you. The empire remembers you. Resistance will cost more than you can afford. And so, even without lifting a blade, the Immortals fought their wars. In posture, in presence, in the imagination of everyone who saw them and whispered of the 1,000 they represented. But all empires age, and even the sharpest myth begins to dull. By the twilight years of the Achaemenid Empire, the Immortals were still feared, still respected, still wrapped in the garments of perfection. But something had shifted, not with a shattering fall, but with a slow, creeping erosion. The machine that had once made them immortal began to falter, not from enemy blades, but from within. Persian kings grew distant from the battlefield. The focus turned inward to courtly games, luxury, and subtle decay, and the Immortals followed suit. Once hardened instruments of absolute discipline, they began to soften. Recruitment standards slipped. Where once only the most loyal and disciplined sons of noble houses were chosen, now favors were exchanged. Strings were pulled. Sons of unqualified nobles were slid quietly into ranks that once required a lifetime of proving oneself. The shell remained. The armor still gleamed. The tiaras were still brushed and fixed. But the spirit, the precision began to drift. Uniformity without discipline. Tradition without soul. The decline remained mostly hidden until 334 BCE. When Alexander of Macedon crossed into Persian lands, he didn't just bring an army. He brought momentum, tactical brilliance, a hunger sharpened on Greek ambition, and a blade honed on years of conquest. At the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE, the Immortals stood at the center of the Persian line, flanking the final Achaemenid king Darius III. This was their moment, the final test of the legend. They fought, brave, unyielding, but it was not enough. Alexander's phalanxes moved with an intelligence the old empire hadn't faced in decades. The Macedonian formation pierced, turned, and flanked with brutal clarity. The Immortals were outmaneuvered, outpaced, outthought. They were not defeated in the traditional sense. They were revealed. The machinery of replacement, once automatic, failed. The seamless substitutions, no longer ready. The pipeline of perfect successors, clogged with politics and delay. And when Alexander entered Persepolis, the heart of the Persian Empire, the Immortals weren't there. The unbroken line had finally broken. It didn't explode. It withered. A slow, quiet vanishing of a force that had once seemed eternal. But here's the part most forget. The story didn't end. Because even in their fall, the Immortals left something behind: a blueprint, a template. Alexander didn't burn their traditions. He borrowed them, folded Persian court rituals into his own, honored their discipline, adopted their elegance. Later, in the Sasanian Empire, a new elite force would rise, never directly descended, but still echoing the myth. They too were called, sometimes by historians, Immortals, 10,000 strong. Elite, synchronized, a whispered resurrection. Because the real power of the Persian Immortals wasn't their spears. It was their idea. They showed the world how to build not just an army but a legend, how to take flesh and cloth and turn it into something bigger than death, bigger than any battlefield. An elite that could hold a blade and hold a room, an army that could conquer cities and silence them. Even after their disappearance, generals and kings remembered. Empire after empire tried to imitate what the Persians had crafted, not just in strategy, but in symbolism. Because in the end, immortality wasn't in their bodies. It was in the shadows they left behind. Of crimes. You see, their legend didn't survive because they won every battle. It lived on because they meant something deeper, something bigger than swords and armor. The Immortals were not just soldiers. They were an idea made real. They were state power made flesh, a living symbol of control, order, and the terrifying efficiency of a system that never blinked. When the Greeks wrote about them, their language was laced with awe and a touch of fear. Herodotus called them the Immortals, not because they couldn't be killed, but because no one ever saw them die. The formation remained. The names didn't matter. You could cut off a head, and another would rise in its place. No funeral, no break, just a ghost that refused to vanish. And to the Greeks, this wasn't bravery, it was something unnatural. They believed war was meant to be messy, passionate, deeply human. The Immortals? They marched like they'd forgotten how to be human. No roaring, no charging, just silence and symmetry, precision so unnerving it bordered on inhuman. And still, the centuries kept whispering their name. Roman writers, centuries after the fall of Persia, still spoke of the Immortals as the ultimate elite, calm, cold, unshakable. Byzantine historians studied their structure, trying to understand how an empire once maintained such unbreakable order. Even Arab chroniclers in the early Islamic period passed down tales of the 10-0, not in mythic exaggeration, but with a kind of nervous respect. They spoke of guards who once stood watch at the gates of kings, spears gleaming like a silver forest under the desert sun. And the name? It never stayed buried. In the later Sasanian Empire, a Persian rebirth centuries after the Achaemenids, an elite cavalry force emerged. Historians sometimes call them the new Immortals. Different uniforms, different battlefield, same purpose. They were the armored fist of the empire. A resurrection, not in bloodline, but in meaning. Even Napoleon, centuries and continents removed from Persepolis, studied their organization, admired their discipline. Envy, after all, is the sincerest form of flattery, especially in empire building. And in our modern stories, books, films, video games, the Immortals still haunt the battlefield, but we so often get them wrong. They're shown as demons, monsters, faceless killers. But the truth? The truth was far more disturbing. They were human, terrifyingly human. Ordinary boys turned into silence, into discipline, into the cold elegance of empire. They didn't need magic to become legends, just a system that erased failure and punished individuality. Their greatest weapon wasn't their blade. It was the idea that they would always be coming, a shadow that never left the horizon. And so they live on in stone, in strategy, in every army that tries to project fear through formation. They live on in whispers, because deep down we know, when power is perfectly organized, endlessly replaced, and utterly committed, it becomes something very close to immortality. Follow or subscribe to the channel, because the next story is just as wild. But first, we head into the steppes of Eurasia. Before there were Amazon queens in myth, there were real women, warrior women riding across the plains of Scythia, armed to the teeth and feared by every army they faced. They weren't rare exceptions, they were the culture. These were the Scythians. Nomadic, ferocious, elusive, and unlike any society the ancient world had encountered. They didn't build cities, they built momentum. And their women? They didn't stay behind weaving by firelight. They rode, hunted, fought, and led. Greek historians were stunned. Herodotus tells us of entire tribes where women refused to marry unless they had killed an enemy in battle. He wrote it as if it were an exotic curiosity. Centuries later, archaeologists began uncovering graves. Real women, real wounds, real weapons. Across Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and southern Russia, burial mounds revealed bodies of young women buried not with jewelry, but with swords, bows, quivers, and armor. Some had arrows still embedded in their bones. These weren't ceremonial tokens, these were battlefield scars. One woman was found with an arrow lodged in her spine, armor on her ribs, and her grave arranged with honor. Not a victim, a veteran. Because in Scythian life, survival didn't care about gender. The steppe demanded movement, precision, and readiness from everyone. Girls learned to shoot as early as boys did. They wore the same leather trousers, the same scale armor, rode the same horses into the same hail of arrows. You couldn't tell man from woman in the dust of battle, and that was the point. But it didn't stop there. These women weren't just fighters. They were mothers, shamans, leaders fierce in war and revered in peace. When the horse galloped home, they stepped off and resumed their rituals. The roles weren't opposites, they were complementary. The Greeks told myths of Amazons. Fantastical, distant, and impossible. But the Scythians were real. They clashed with Persia, skirmished with Greeks, terrified Macedonians. For centuries, they ruled the steppe not from thrones, but from saddles. And they weren't the only warrior women who shattered the mold. Thousands of miles away, in the thick forests and coastal fortresses of West Africa, another force was rising, and this one would leave European colonizers trembling. The kingdom of Dahomey, in modern-day Benin, didn't just allow women in its military, it built an elite corps of them. They were called the Agogi. But the French had another name, the Dahomey Amazons. They weren't mythical. They were trained, blooded, and absolutely fearless. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Agogi were not just guards for the king, they were the kingdom's sword. Elite infantry, specialists in ambush, assassination, and shock tactics. And they never retreated. They trained with machetes, rifles, and raw discipline. They climbed thorn hedges barefoot. They learned to kill silently. European colonizers were shocked not only by their existence, but by their efficiency. These weren't mascots, these were warriors. And if the enemy underestimated them, they didn't live long enough to do it again. So what ties all these forces together? From the Immortals to the Scythians to the Agogi, not just strength, system, not just battle, belief. Each one built more than an army, they built myths that outlived empires. Myths based on repetition, unity, and one powerful message: we are always coming. And that might be the most immortal thing of all. Of crimes. You want to know what fear looks like when it walks on 2 feet? Picture this. A young girl, barely old enough to lift a blade, stepping into a courtyard laced with thorns and silence. She's about to train not for sport, not for pride, but for war, and she won't be going home. Not now, not ever, because she's being forged into one of the fiercest military units the colonial world would ever face. The Agogi, the real-life warrior women of the kingdom of Dahomey. At first, they were hunters, palace aides, quiet shadows behind the throne. But over generations, they evolved into something else, entirely, a storm wrapped in skin. Selected as children for strength, defiance, or sheer willpower, the Agogi were taken from their families and placed under the king's command. There were no exceptions, no softness, no escape. Their childhoods didn't end, they were cut away. Training was brutal, calculated to break what could be broken and sharpen what remained. They sprinted through thorn hedges barefoot. They fought each other with live blades. They swore celibacy, swore allegiance, swore never to retreat. Loyalty to the king wasn't a choice. It was oxygen. Their uniforms were symbolic but deadly braided sashes across the chest. Muskets slung over shoulders, machetes glinting at the hip. But their true edge wasn't steel. It was fearlessness. The kind of calm that made even experienced European officers shudder. One French commander during the colonial campaigns described watching one of these warriors, a single woman, sprint toward a soldier, slice open his throat with terrifying precision, then pause, and casually wipe her blade clean like she was clearing her nails. That wasn't savagery. That was ritual. That was control. These weren't mascots or bodyguards. The Agogi were shock troops. First in, last out. They didn't camp behind the lines. They led the charge. In the brutal Franco-Dahomey wars of the 1890s, these women squared off against French soldiers with modern rifles and artillery, and still managed to launch deadly ambushes under the cover of night. Street by street, grove by grove, they fought like wildfire, unshaken by the odds. They didn't win every battle, but they forced the French colonial juggernauts who thought they'd crush Dahomey in a weekend to pause, to adapt, to reconsider every assumption they had about women and war. But the Agogi weren't just a military force. They were a paradox warriors in a deeply patriarchal world who carved out autonomy not through quiet diplomacy, but through blades and blood. They advised kings. They led ceremonies. They were symbols and weapons, both at once. In a world that demanded they be small, they stood colossal. Even after the fall of Dahomey, their legend refused to die. Instead, it multiplied. Today, you'll see echoes of the Agogi in fiction like the Dora Milaje in Marvel's Black Panther. But make no mistake, reality came first. And it was far more savage, far more sacred, and far more unforgettable. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe the channel now. These women didn't whisper history, they roared it. But let's travel further from Africa's fire to Japan's steel. Because in the shadowed corners of medieval Japan, another woman stepped out of myth and into the battlefield. Her name? Tomoe Gozen, a name that still feels like the sound of a blade being drawn. She wasn't born into legend, she carved it with her own hands. It's the late 12th century. Civil war tears Japan apart. The Minamoto and Taira clans clash for power. Samurai codes are being written in blood. And in the center of it all stands Tomoe. Not in the kitchen, not behind a noble husband, but at the front of the battlefield. Armor on her shoulders, bow in her hands, and eyes like lightning storms. She served Minamoto no Yoshinaka, a warlord, and some whisper her lover. But Tomoe wasn't a concubine in armor. She was a commander, trained in Kyudo, Kenjutsu, and the tactics of war. She was said to be strikingly beautiful white skin, flowing hair, elegant features. But the next line in the scrolls hits like thunder. She was worth 1,000 warriors. That's not a compliment. That's a reckoning. At the Battle of Iwazu in 1184, as Yoshinaka's forces were encircled and collapse loomed, he ordered a final stand. Some legends say he begged Tomoe to flee. She refused. She turned, faced a charging enemy samurai, and according to the Heike Monogatari dismounted him, wrestled him to the ground, and beheaded him in one clean motion. Then she got back on her horse and rode into chaos like death itself, wore silk sleeves. What happened to her afterward is a mystery. Some say she was captured and forced into marriage. Others claim she became a nun, vanishing into quiet obscurity. Or maybe, just maybe, she rode out of history's reach on a warhorse black as midnight. We'll never know. But Japan never forgot her. Tomoe Gozen still appears in theatre, folklore, and memory, a blade in a world of walls. A warrior in a society that told women to kneel. She didn't fight for glory. She fought for existence. Now take a breath, because the next name is carved into the bones of Roman pride. Boudica. You've heard it maybe. A whisper, a statue, a legend. But here's the truth. She wasn't a story. She was a problem for the Roman Empire. She was the wife of a client king, Prasutagus, a puppet installed by Rome to keep the British tribes in line. But when he died, Rome didn't honor his will. They took his land, flogged Boudica in public, and in one of the most brutal pages in ancient record, they raped her daughters. Rome expected her to crumble. She set the sky on fire instead. Around 60 CE, Boudica rallied the tribes of Britannia into a single, furious war engine. She wasn't some rebel queen waving from the back. She led from the front in a chariot, spear in hand, red hair whipping in the wind like a banner of vengeance. She burned Colchester, then London, then St. Albans. And wherever she went, she left Roman arrogance in ashes. Tens of thousands of Romans and collaborators died. Not in tactical skirmishes, in massacres. Her wrath was not clinical, it was personal. But the Roman legions under Suetonius regrouped. They lured her into an open battle, tight formations, iron discipline versus sheer numbers and fury. The Britons broke, and facing defeat, Boudica took poison rather than be paraded through Rome in chains. She lost the war, but she won something bigger. Her name became a legend, not just in Britain, but across time, a symbol of rebellion, of defiance, of a woman who refused to be broken, even when Rome itself tried. In later centuries, her statue would rise beside Big Ben. She became the face of British resistance, first against the Romans, then against every tyrant that followed. So subscribe the channel, because this isn't the end. These women weren't mythical, they were inevitable, and we're not done. One more chapter, one more name, and this one comes galloping out of the Mongol Empire, not as a daughter, not as a wife, but as a wrestler, a warrior, a champion. Her name? Kutulun. She was the great-great-granddaughter of Genghis Khan, but that wasn't her claim to fame. Her legend wasn't built on bloodlines, it was built on body slams. Born around 1260 CE, Kutulun was the daughter of Kaidu Khan, a rival to Kublai Khan. She was trained like a warrior prince. Archery, horse riding, military command. But what made her famous? Wrestling. Among the Mongols, wrestling wasn't sport. It was honor. And Cutulun? She never lost. She vowed she'd only marry a man who could defeat her in a match. Dozens tried, all failed, and many walked away with bruises and broken egos. Some even gambled flocks of horses which Cutulun gladly collected. One tale says she amassed 10 horses just by winning. But this wasn't a sideshow. She fought beside her father in real battles against rival Mongol clans, against the Chinese. She led troops, broke enemy lines. Her father even considered naming her as his heir. That's how trusted she was. It didn't happen, of course. The old guard couldn't handle a woman with that much power. But even Marco Polo, yes, that Marco Polo wrote of a Mongol princess who fought like a tiger and rode like a god. So what do all these stories have in common? They weren't accidents. They weren't fairy tales. They were warnings. Because when a woman refuses to kneel, history doesn't know what to do with her. Except remember, of crimes. You ever hear the sound of history trying to erase a woman's fire? It doesn't shout, it whispers, reshapes, softens the sharp edges, turns warriors into lovers, leaders into footnotes. But some names cut too deep to be smoothed out. And one of them? Cutulun. Her legend was inconvenient, too bold, too physical, too victorious. So storytellers tried to twist her into a lovesick daughter or a mythical oddity. But she wasn't chasing romancege, was choking out her suitors in wrestling matches. Literally, Cutulun was real, and her strength wasn't symbolicit, was measurable. Measured in broken egos, bruised ribs, and a stable packed with horses she won through sheer dominance. Because in the most hyper-masculine empire Earth had ever seen, the Mongol Emperor woman didn't just rise, she charged. She wasn't allowed to do it. She did it anyway, because no one could stop her. And speaking of unstoppable, hit that subscribe button right now if you haven't already. These aren't bedtime stories. These are battles carved into memory. Now imagine this. In a Europe where women couldn't vote, couldn't own land freely, and could get arrested for wearing pants, a teenage girl not only wore armor, led an army. That's Joan of Arc for you. Not born to power, not trained by generals. Born in 1412 in a speck of a village called Domremy, Joan was an illiterate farm girl. But by 17, she would walk into royal courts, command French forces, and twist the spine of the 100 Years' War. She claimed she was guided not by strategy, not by advisors, but by voices. Saints, archangels, Michael, Catherine, and Margaret. They told her she had been chosen to drive the English out of France and crown the rightful king, Charles, at Reims. Sounds like madness, right? But the crazy thing is, people listened. They tested her. Clergy, nobles, skeptics grilled her with questions for weeks. She had no military background, no noble blood, but something about her certainty, her charisma unlocked doors. The future King Charles gave her troops and told her to break the siege at Orléans. And break it she did. She didn't hide behind the lines or wave flags. She was in the fight. Sword drawn, banner raised, rallying broken spirits and shaming cowardly commanders into action. Arrows flew, cannons roared. Joan charged forward, and the city was saved. In days, she became a national symbol. They called her the Maid of Orléans, the divine spark in a country on the edge of collapse. When Charles was finally crowned, it wasn't his lineage that got him there. It was the girl in white armor. But every legend draws enemies. In 1430, Joan was captured by Burgundians, French allies of the English. And instead of treating her like a prisoner of war, they put her on trial. A sham trial. A trial rigged to make her fall. Her crimes? Heresy. Witchcraft. Ohand wearing men's clothing. She was 19 when they tied her to a stake in the market square of Rouen and set her on fire. She didn't scream for mercy. Years later, the church reversed the verdict. Centuries later, she was made a saint. And today, Joan of Arc is more than a name. She's a thunderclap. A reminder that even when the world says, "You can't," there's always one voice brave enough to say, "Watch me." Now let's pivot. But we're not slowing down. We're heading east over Japan on the brink of transformation. By the late 1860s, the age of the samurai was fading. Guns replaced swords. Tradition gave way to industry. But one final stand for the old ways would be led not by an aging warlord, but by a woman wielding a naginata. Her name? Nakano Takeko. Born in 1847 into a family of scholars and warriors, Nakano was a bridge between intellect and blade. She studied Chinese classics, calligraphy, and martial arts. But it was the naginata long pole weapon curved like a crescent moon that became her soul. Under her adoptive father, a martial arts master, she trained like the future depended on it. And when war came, she didn't hesitate. In 1868, civil conflict erupted between imperial forces and the fading Tokugawa shogunate. The war was modernizing guns, artillery, Western tactics. Women weren't supposed to fight. So Nakano formed her own army. The Joshitaya band of women warriors dressed in hakama, and traditional armor was unofficial, unapproved, and absolutely fearless. They fought in the Battle of Aizu, defending their home with spears and fire against modern rifles. Witnesses say Nakano struck down enemies in close quarters before being shot in the chest. Knowing what could happen if she fell into enemy hands' defilement, humiliation, she asked her sister to do the unthinkable. Behead her. And she did. Nakano's body was buried beside her sword in Fukushima. Today, statues stand in her honor not just as a samurai, but as the final samurai woman. She didn't fight for a paycheck or glory. She fought to remind the world that the spirit of the warrior doesn't care about gender, modernity, or odds. And just when you think the fire's done burning, another name rises from the ashes of war. Lyudmila Pavlichenko. Lady Death. The name sent shivers down Nazi spines. She wasn't a poster girl. She wasn't a morale symbol. She was a Soviet sniper who racked up 309 confirmed kills, including 36 enemy snipers. Not just the deadliest female sniper in history, one of the deadliest, period. Born in 1916 in what's now Ukraine, Lyudmila didn't come from war. She studied history at university. She had plans, books to read, a life to build. But when the Nazis invaded in 1941, she put down her books and picked up a rifle. At first, they laughed. A woman sniper? Ridiculous. Then she started hitting targets. Enemy soldiers, officers, snipers who thought they were safe. And the laughter stopped. She fought at Odessa, at Sevastopol. She endured bombardments, frostbite, and trench rot. She was wounded multiple times. One shell knocked her unconscious. When she woke, she got back to the rifle. Always back to the rifle. Her legend grew. Soviet commanders praised her. German propaganda feared her. The Nazis nicknamed her Lady Death, and for once, the nickname fit. But here's what makes her story even more fascinating. After being pulled from the front lines for safety, she was sent on a diplomatic mission to America. She met Eleanor Roosevelt, gave speeches, and when an American journalist asked her whether women should fight, she didn't flinch. "I am 25 years old," she said. "I have killed 309 fascist invaders. Do you not think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" Mic dropped. After the war, she returned to university, faded into quiet life. But her name? Still a legend in military academies around the world. That's the thread that binds all these women together. Kutalun, Joan, Nakano, Lyudmila. They didn't break barriers. They ignored them. They didn't seek permission. They simply acted. Their strength wasn't in being allowed to fight, it was in refusing to be stopped. So if these stories shake something loose in your soul, follow or subscribe the channel. We've got more to uncover, and history isn't done whispering yet. You've heard the phrase, music moves the soul, right? Well, in the ancient world, music didn't just move it, it summoned it. From desert temples to marble theatres, music wasn't background noise. It was the bridge between gods and mortals, order and chaos, the seen and the unseen. And nothing symbolized that divine connection more hauntingly than the bull-headed lyre of Mesopotamia. Imagine this, its body carved like a resting bull, strong and still. Gold leaf glimmered across its head, catching torchlight like fire caught in motion. A beard of lapis lazuli shimmered below, as if the heavens had woven themselves into this instrument of earth. But this wasn't some fancy court decoration. No, the bull wasn't chosen for beauty. It was chosen for meaning, for power. The bull was strength, fertility, endurance. When its image was merged with a lyre, it wasn't just music being played. It was a sacred act, a channeling. Played with gentle fingers or a curved plectrum, the lyre's sound was haunting. Not quite sorrow, not quite joy, something in between. A sound that lingered in the bones long after it faded from the air. And while we'll never know exactly what Sumerian melodies sounded like, scholars believe their music ran on a 7-note scale like ours. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. Thousands of years ago, they were already mapping out the foundations of music theory. We've even found clay tablets etched with some of the earliest musical notation ever discovered. That's not just history. That's humanity trying to leave behind a song written in stone. Lyres weren't reserved for royal entertainment either. In temples, they were part of rituals played during offerings, sung alongside hymns to deities like Inanna and Enlil. Music didn't fill the silence. It invoked the sacred. And when someone died, the lyre mourned with the living. Its notes marked transitions, like a candle burning at both ends, illuminating the end of one life and the beginning of something unknown. Lyres were not just instruments. They were companions for the soul's journey. And those who played them? Often priestesses. Women who carried not only melodies but mystery strained from childhood in schools for scribes and musicians. They weren't performers. They were keepers of memory. Even today, when replicas are plucked in museums, those soft twangs seem to call out to something older in us, as if reminding us that before Mozart, before medieval bards or Renaissance composers, there were humans in the desert, staring at stars and plucking strings for gods. Now, while the lyre sang softly to the heavens, the aloso, that was a whole different beast. Where the lyre whispered, the aulos screamed, cried, laughed, collapsed, resurrected. If the lyre was spiritual, the aulos was visceral, emotional, messy, human. Picture it, 2 pipes, one in each hand, each with reeds and finger holes, played simultaneously, requiring insane breath control and endurance. It was like playing 2 clarinets at once while sprinting. Musicians learned circular breathing, inhaling through the nose, while exhaling through puffed cheeks, keeping a continuous stream of sound going for minutes, even hours. Their faces would contort, cheeks ballooning so intensely that Greek athletes actually mocked aulos players for looking ridiculous. But no one laughed when the music started. The sound wasn't pretty. It wasn't supposed to be. It was raw, penetrating, unnerving. Something between a scream and a dance. A chaos that made order feel distant. And while the lyre belonged to Apollo, god of reason, the aulos was claimed by Dionysus, god of wine, ecstasy, madness. Yeah, that Dionysus. The one whose parties made Vegas look like a prayer circle. The aulos became the instrument of rituals and revolutions. Played during Dionysian festivals where dancers spun until they collapsed, where identities melted into the divine, where boundaries blurred in music-induced trance. But it wasn't just for the wild. The aulos was also present on the battlefield. Greek hoplites, the elite citizen soldiers, marched to its beat. No drum, no chant. Just the high, sharp cry of the aulos cutting through the morning mist, keeping every footstep in sync. It was rhythm as discipline, melody as warcraft. And then, in the Greek theatre, it took on yet another life. In tragedies by Sophocles and Euripides, the aulos gave voice to grief, madness, and fate. It wasn't the background score. It was the emotional narrator, the invisible actor bleeding through every scene. You didn't just hear it, you felt it behind your ribs. Some alluded that even the gods themselves listened differently when the aulos played. It's strange, isn't it? We think of the ancient world as silent stone, still statues, lost ruins, but they weren't quiet. Not at all. They were alive with sound that meant something. So when we talk about the instruments of the ancient world, the bull lyre, the aulos, we're not just talking about music. We're talking about belief systems, emotional control, spiritual warfare. The music wasn't just heard, it was used. To heal, to mourn, to manipulate, to transcend. And if you're feeling that if this kind of hidden history hits different, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now, because there's more sound buried in the silence of history than you think. And we're not done listening. Plato, one of the greatest minds of the ancient world, hated the Orlos. Well, hated might be strong, but he certainly distrusted it. In his imagined perfect society, the Republic, the Orlos was cast out not for lack of musical merit but for its dangerous power. Too emotional, too overwhelming, too raw for rational minds. He preferred the orderly tones of the lyre, or kithara, mathematically pure, intellectually safe. And yet, even Plato couldn't deny it. The Orlos could shake a soul. It could imitate sorrow, rage, bliss sometimes all at once. One breath through its dual reeds could carry the force of an army or the heartbreak of a god. Fragments of these ancient instruments now lie silent in museum glass cases. But modern reconstructions hint at their former glory, wild, piercing, uncaged. Where the lyre sang like a scholar, the Orlos wailed like a prophet in crisis. It wasn't crafted for perfection, it was built for release. And across the world in ancient China, another form of musical philosophy was unfolding not through chaos, but through balance. In the scholar studios and imperial courts, music was more than entertainment, it was a way of being, a reflection of the cosmos. And two stringed instruments captured that vision with haunting grace, the guqin and the guzheng. Now at first glance, they may look like siblings, both long wooden zithers strung with silk, both plucked rather than bowed. But their souls? Entirely different. The guqin is the elder, a revered ancestor with over 30 years of history. 7 strings, no frets, no flash. Its music is soft, whispering. A single note echoes like raindrops on a quiet pond, delicate, deliberate, profound. To an untrained ear, it may sound like silence with a heartbeat. But to the ancient Chinese philosophers, it was the sound of virtue itself. Confucius is said to have played the guqin, not for applause but to cultivate moral character, to align the self with the heavens. Learning the guqin wasn't about performing. It was about discipline, contemplation, civilization. It was music as self-mastery. The guzheng, on the other hand, it was built to shine. A younger cousin, louder, brighter, with 16 to 21 strings, sometimes even more in modern versions. Its melodies cascade, like waterfalls bold, expressive, impossible to ignore. Its curved body and movable bridges allowed for sliding notes, dramatic glissandos, finger runs that glittered like gold through palace corridors. It was music for crowds, for banquets, for storytellers and soldiers alike. Where the guqin whispered to sages, the guzheng sang to the world. In court halls and folk theatres, it mimicked everything from galloping horses to weeping lovers. A performer's fingers fitted with plectrum scud paint soundscapes as vivid as any scroll. One moment a mountain storm, the next a lover's farewell. Both instruments had sacred roles. The guqin was often paired with poetry and meditation. It was used in lectures, rituals, and scholarly rites. The guzheng, meanwhile, brought fire to opera stages and epics of war. They told the same story but from opposite ends of the emotional spectrum. And yes, there was a gender divide. The guqin, scholarly and introspective, became associated with men, especially Confucian elites. The guzheng, expressive and outward-facing, became more associated with women in later dynasties. But both were respected, both were taught, both were part of a musical education that shaped the Chinese soul. Even now, centuries later, they survive echoing through conservatories, concert halls, and street performances. They are living threads from an ancient civilization where sound was seen as moral structure, not just auditory pleasure. And speaking of music that shaped the soul, in ancient Egypt, music was never just background ambience. It was a sacred technologia, bridge between life and death, order and chaos, the mortal and the divine. You could hear it in every corner of life, from the royal court to the Nile's muddy banks, from temple chambers to dusty workfields. The heartbeat of Egypt was rhythmic, melodic, and deeply spiritual. One of the oldest and most iconic Egyptian instruments? The harp. Early harps were simply bent stick with strings. But over time, they became towering constructions, taller than a grown man, their frames angular, their curves graceful. These weren't just decorative pieces, they were tools of transcendence. Temple musicians would pluck their strings to accompany sacred rites, and in tomb paintings, you'll often see harpists playing for the dead, not for entertainment. but to soothe the soul into eternity. Then there was the sistrum. Now this wasn't subtle. Imagine a sacred rattle made of metal, its loose crossbars jangling wildly when shaken. Associated with the goddess Hathor, patron of music, motherhood, and joy, the sistrum was a ritual weapon of sound. Its clang wasn't meant to be pretty. It was meant to purify, to summon gods, to banish evil. A temple priestess shaking a sistrum wasn't making noise. She was realigning the cosmos. Wind instruments also played a key role. Flutes made from reeds or bone offered airy, breathy tones during religious processions. Double clarinetstwo pipes played at once created rich, buzzing harmonies, eerily similar to the Greek olos. They didn't just produce melody, they evoked states of being. And then came percussion frame drums, hand clappers, castanets pulsing through dances and festivals, driving rhythm into ritual, giving beat to belief. Professional musicians in Egypt weren't background performers, they were spiritual figures. Many were women depicted in temple art as harpists, flutists, and vocalists. Some held titles like Chantress of Amun or Musician of Isis. They weren't there to entertain, they were voices of the gods. Music in Egypt was deeply functional. It marked life's most sacred transitions: birth, worship, death. It wasn't art for art's sake. It was communication with ancestors, with spirits, with deities watching from the stars. And in all of these places, Mesopotamia, Greece, China, Egypt, music was more than melody. It was memory, identity, power. So next time you tap a rhythm on your desk, or hum without thinking, or feel chills during a song, remember, you're echoing something ancient, something that shaped empires, moved kings, and comforted the dead. And if these hidden histories are as fascinating to you as they are to me, hit that follow or subscribe button right now, because we're just scratching the surface. The ancient world sang. And if you listen closely, it still does. Let me ask you something. If your soul had a voice, what would it sound like? Would it be a melody, a chant, or perhaps a thunderous rhythm pulsing through the earth itself? In ancient Africa, they already knew the answer. Music wasn't something you simply played or heard, it was something you became. It was breath, it was blood, it was the voice of memory itself, thundering through time. Egypt, with all its gold and glory, left us many treasures, but in music, it left us mystery. Unlike Mesopotamia or Greece, where carved tablets and scrolls offer clues to their melodies, Egyptian musical notation remains elusive, lost to sand and silence. But they didn't need musical manuscripts to tell their story. Their instruments painted across tomb walls, carved into temple reliefs, buried in sacred chambers speak volumes. And what they tell us is profound. To the ancient Egyptians, music was more than art. It was structure, emotion, magic, a language between this world and the next. Even in death, you didn't go silent. Instruments were buried with nobles and priests, so they could continue playing in the afterlife, in the legendary field of reeds, a paradise where beauty never faded and music never ceased. Because to them, music wasn't just a pastime, it was eternity's language. But let's leave the Nile for a moment and journey further south and west across sweeping savannas and dense forests to where rhythm didn't whisper, it shouted. In ancient African cultures stretching across the continent, especially in the rich kingdoms of the West, music was communication. The drum didn't just beat, it spoke. And I don't mean that metaphorically. Before the written word, before postage, before signal fires, there was the talking drum. Sculpted like an hourglass, strung with tension cords, and played with a curved stick. This drum wasn't just musical, it was linguistic. In places like the Yoruba lands of West Africa, where language is tonal, a skilled drummer could imitate speech by tightening or loosening the cords while striking. Entire phrases could be transmitted, love letters, warnings, royal decrees, even full stories sent across miles to other villages like ancient wireless signals. No wires, no ink, just rhythm and genius. Imagine it, a family hearing of a birth across the valley, not by courier, but by beat. A village warned of war through a crescendo in the canopy. The first internet, carved from wood and stretched with skin. But it didn't stop at function. These drums were sacred. In ancient kingdoms like Kush, Nok, If, and Benin, they were not instruments, they were portals. When struck with intention, they were believed to summon spirits, to awaken ancestors, and to open pathways between the human and the divine. In court rituals, the king's arrival was heralded by drum beats. In funerals, drums didn't mourn the dead, they guided them. In healing ceremonies, the rhythm itself was medicine. It's said that to beat a sacred drum wasn't a performance, it was an invocation. There were countless types. The djembe, played with bare hands, deep and resonant. The dundun, big and bold, beating like thunder. The bugarabu, melodic and warm. The krin, carved from logs and played with sticks. Each had its place in the musical ecosystem, like voices in a choir, like organs in a body, and each was built with reverence, carved from single pieces of wood, often passed down from father to son, from master to apprentice. Even the crafting of a drum was spiritual. Trees were selected with ritual, animals honored for their hides, and before a drum ever sang, it was blessed. But percussion in Africa didn't end with drums. Oh no. There were rattles, bells, iron gongs, shakers, thumb pianos, each one adding its own flavor to the vast stew of sound. The result? A polyrhythmic masterpiece so complex, so layered, it would take centuries before Western musicians even understood what was happening. Because in Africa, music wasn't something you sat down to appreciate. You didn't clap politely. You moved, you danced, you breathed with it. The drummer wasn't a performer. He was a conductor of spirit. The audience wasn't passive. They were participants. And those rhythms traveled. Across deserts, through the Nile, and later tragically through the Atlantic, carried in the hearts and memories of enslaved Africans. And though torn from home, their music endured, shaping the heartbeat of Brazil, the soul of the Caribbean, the roots of gospel, jazz, blues, and hip-hop. But at its core, no matter where it went, the rhythm always said the same thing. We are still here. And now, let's climb. High into the sky, where the mountains meet the clouds, the ancient Andes. In the highlands of South America, where the air is thin and the earth itself feels closer to heaven, music took a different form. Here, it was not strings or skins that dominated, it was wind. The Andean world, home to civilizations like the Nazca, Moche, and later, the mighty Inca birthed a soundscape carved from breath and stone. Their music was built from aerophones, flutes, whistles, ocarinas, but none more iconic than the panpipes, or as they were known, siku. At first glance, the siku seems simple, just a series of reeds bound together in descending order. But once played, it's mesmerizing. Each pipe produces a single tone. Together, they form an instrument as ancient as the mountains and just as mysterious. What made them magical wasn't just their sound, but how they were played. The siku was often split between two musicians, each with alternating pipes, meaning neither could play a full melody alone. Only together could the song be complete. Isn't that beautiful? A culture that built collaboration into its music. The melody didn't live in one person. It lived in the space between them, in breath shared, in timing matched, in unity. Andean music was deeply connected to nature. The wind, the rain, the call of birds. It was used in farming rituals to honor the earth gods, in festivals to mark the seasons, in royal ceremonies to connect rulers to the heavens. They played bone flutes shaped like condors, ocarinas molded like jaguars, instruments that looked like animals but sounded like sky. Their music echoed off stone temples like Machu Picchu, floating over terraced farms and ancient roads that still wind like veins across the mountains. And just like in Africa, music here was never separate from identity. It was spiritual, agricultural, political. To play was to pray, to sing was to remember, and to dance was to celebrate that you belonged to the land, to the people, to the divine. Whether struck, plucked, or blown music in the ancient world wasn't a product, it was a presence, a force. And if you're feeling that rhythm now in your chest, in your fingertips, don't ignore it. It's a memory older than language. Subscribe to the channel if you want to keep uncovering these stories that have been waiting thousands of years to be heard again. Because the ancient world hasn't gone quiet. You just have to listen closely. If you've ever stood at the edge of a mountain and felt the wind hum through the rocks, you've already heard a whisper of the Andes. There, among the clouds and stone-carved cities, ancient music didn't rise from strings or skins, it floated on breath. The siku panpipes bound together in delicate rows was more than an instrument. It was a conversation with the wind itself. Crafted from bamboo, each pipe of the siku played a single note. But here's the magic. The melodies weren't created by one person alone. Two musicians would play together in perfect synchrony, alternating notes in a technique called hocketing. Like two lungs breathing as one, their melodies were incomplete in isolation, but together they became whole. In the Andean world, music wasn't a solo act. It was a reflection of the universe, dual, balanced, interwoven, just like life. But the siku was only one voice in the Andean soundscape. Flutes carved from bone, clay, and reed hung from necklaces or echoed across valleys in low, haunting tones. Many were shaped like birds or snakes, creatures believed to carry spiritual messages. Each note was more than a sound. It was a bridge between the human and the divine. And then there were the whistling vessels, yes, musical pottery. Crafted by the Mocha civilization, these ceramic creations made sound not by lips or fingers, but by water. Pour it in, and the vessel would exhale a ghostly whistle, triggered by an internal chamber. They weren't just artifacts. They were rituals in clay, where water, air, and sound danced together as one. In the Inca Empire, music wasn't an ornament of culture. It was its heartbeat. From births to funerals, harvests to wars, the Incas had a melody for every chapter of life. They offered flutes and songs to Inti, the sun god, and Pachamama, the earth mother, believing breath itself could be an act of worship. Even their armies marched with musicians. War, for them, wasn't just combat. It was choreography. Although Spanish colonization tried to silence these sounds, it failed. In the highlands of Peru and the mountains of Bolivia, Andean flutes still sing. They are the echo of ancestors, the voice of stone and sky. And they remind us that music can outlive empires. But if you're still with us, don't forget, subscribe to the channel. These stories are just getting started, and your support keeps them alive. Now, travel with me to the ancient lands of the Indian subcontinent, a place where music wasn't just art, it was cosmic architecture. But imagine this, the entire universe, born from a single sound, Om, Toan. According to Hindu philosophy, this primal vibration was the root of all existence. And from it grew one of the oldest and most intricate musical traditions in the world. Not a tradition not built for stages or applause, but for spiritual transformation. The Vedas, written over 3,000 years ago, contain hymns called samans. But these weren't meant to be read. They were meant to be sung. Each note, each pitch, carried precise energy designed to align the soul with divine forces. Brahmin priests didn't just memorize words. They trained their voices like sacred tools, mastering breath control and melodic cadence. Because in these rituals, a mispronounced tone wasn't just a mistake. It could corrupt the entire ceremony. And their instruments? They weren't props. They were symbols. The veena. A plucked string instrument with a hollow gourd resonator was more than just wood and string. It was said to echo the vibrations of the universe. The goddess Saraswati, deity of knowledge and arts, was always depicted holding one. To play the veena was to tune into cosmic truth. Then there was the bansuri, a bamboo flute, so simple, yet so profound. It was said to be the favorite of Lord Krishna, the divine cowherd whose melodies could tame beasts, summon lovers, and even shake the heavens. The bansuri wasn't played, it was invoked.